The morning fog hung thick over Rechlin Airfield on March 15, 1944, as Oberst Hans Werner stood beside the most dangerous trophy the Luftwaffe had ever captured. The silver fighter gleamed through the mist like a ghost, an American P-51 Mustang, barely scratched, sitting on German soil. Werner's hand trembled slightly as he touched the aircraft's smooth aluminum skin. In his 20 years of military aviation, he had never seen anything like it. The Mustang had crash-landed 2 days earlier after its pilot became disoriented in heavy clouds over occupied France. The American had walked away without a scratch, and now sat in a POW camp, probably believing his war was over. He had no idea that his aircraft was about to deliver the most devastating intelligence report the Third Reich would receive that year. "Herr Oberst," called out Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, the Luftwaffe's chief test pilot, his voice barely concealing his excitement. "The engineers have finished their preliminary inspection. She's ready to fly." Werner nodded slowly, but his stomach twisted with an emotion he hadn't felt since his first combat mission over Poland. Fear. Not fear of flying, but fear of what they might discover. Around them, a crowd had gathered. Generals from Berlin, engineers from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, intelligence officers with notepads, and battle-hardened pilots who had faced these silver demons in the sky. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What made the Mustang so deadly? Why were German aces men who had shot down dozens of Soviet and British aircraft falling from the sky when they encountered these American fighters? The numbers were already horrifying. In the past 3 months, the Luftwaffe had lost over 800 aircraft defending the Reich. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable men who had survived years of combat, were disappearing at an alarming rate. And increasingly, the kill reports mentioned one aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. Werner walked around the fighter slowly, examining every detail. It seemed impossibly delicate compared to the brutal, powerful German fighters. The 4-190 was a sledgehammer. The Bf-109 was a rapier. But this looked like a racing plane. Something that belonged at an air show, not in combat. "It's smaller than I expected," murmured General Major Adolf Galland, Germany's youngest general and one of its greatest aces. He had flown up from Berlin specifically for this test. His face was drawn, aged beyond his 32 years by the weight of watching his pilots die. "How much does it weigh?" "Empty? Less than 3,000 kilograms, replied one of the engineers, consulting his notes. "Fully loaded for combat, about 4,200. Galland's eyes widened. "That's nearly a ton lighter than our fighters." "Impossible," scoffed Major Gunther Roll, another legendary ace with over 200 kills. "It must be a stripped-down version. No armor, no guns." 6. 50 caliber machine guns, the engineer interrupted. Full ammunition load. Armor plating behind the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks. And he paused dramatically. Fuel capacity of over 1,400 liters with drop tanks. The silence that followed was deafening. Rahl's face had gone pale. Werner understood why. Their Bf-109 seconds carried around 400 liters internally. Even with drop tanks, they were lucky to have 90 minutes of flight time. This American fighter could stay in the air for hours, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. "Gentlemen," Werner announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of disbelief, "Hauptmann Müller will conduct the first test flight. We will fly our best fighters against him. We need to know everything: speed, climb rate, turning ability, diving characteristics, everything." Müller climbed into the cockpit, and Werner watched as the test pilot's expression changed. First confusion, then surprise, then something close to wonder. "Herr Oberst," Müller called down. "The visibility. I can see in every direction." "There's barely any nose in front of me, and the canopy." He twisted around in his seat. "I can see directly behind me. Our pilots are flying blind compared to this." Werner felt his blood run cold. They hadn't even started the engine, and already they were learning why German pilots were dying. The Packard Merlin engine roared to life with a sound unlike anything on the field. Not the harsh mechanical growl of a German engine, but something smoother, more refined, yet somehow more menacing. The four-bladed propeller became a blur, and the Mustang seemed to strain against its brakes like a hunting dog waiting to be released. Muller released the brakes, and the silver fighter rolled forward, accelerating with shocking speed. The takeoff run was impossibly short. Within seconds, the Mustang was airborne, climbing at an angle that made the watching pilots gasp. "Time the climb to 3,000 meters, Werner ordered. They watched in stunned silence as the Mustang clawed its way upward, seeming to hang on its propeller. In the distance, 2 full 190 seconds were taking off Germany's finest fighters, flown by experienced pilots who knew their aircraft intimately. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, Mueller's voice crackled over the radio. 3,000 meters, starting combat trials. Werner raised his binoculars and watched as the battle began. What he was about to witness would confirm his worst fears and change everything he thought he knew about air combat. The Mustang turned toward the approaching Focke-Wulfs, and the dance of death began. The first pass happened so fast that the observers on the ground almost missed it. The 2 for 190 seconds, painted in standard Luftwaffe gray-green camouflage, approached the Mustang in a classic pincer maneuver, one high, one low. These were tactics that had worked against Spitfires, against Thunderbolts, against everything the Allies had thrown at them. Muller waited until the last possible second, then pulled back on the stick. The Mustang didn't just climb, it rocketed upward in a near-vertical ascent that defied physics. The lower 190 shot passed underneath, its pilot cursing over the radio. The higher Focke-Wulf tried to follow, straining its engine, but the Mustang was already gone, already 500 meters higher. "Impossible," Rahl whispered beside Werner. "That rate of climb, our intelligence said the Mustang was fast, but this." Over the radio, they could hear the German pilots struggling. "He's too fast. I can't keep him in sight." "Coming around for another pass," one pilot reported, his voice tight with concentration. This time, the foe 190 seconds tried different tactics. They dove on the Mustang from above, using their superior diving speed, one of the few advantages German fighters had. The Focke-Wulf was a brick in a dive, heavy and fast. But Muller didn't try to outdive them. Instead, he did something that made Werner's heart stop. The Mustang snap-rolled to the left, then pulled into the tightest turn Werner had ever seen. The silver fighter seemed to pivot on a single wing, bleeding speed, but gaining position. Within seconds, Mueller was on the tail of one of the foe 190 seconds. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" the German pilot shouted in mock panic, following the exercise protocol. "He's locked on me." The second 190 tried to help his wingman, turning hard to get behind the Mustang, but Mueller simply poured on the power, and the American fighter accelerated away as if the Focke-Wulf was standing still. "Top speed?" Werner barked at the radio operator. Mueller reports. Herr Oberst. He reports 710 kilometers per hour at 7,000 meters altitude. Werner felt the blood drain from his face. The Fort 190's top speed was barely 650 kilometers per hour, and that was at optimal altitude with a fresh engine. The Bf 109 could barely manage 620. The mock combat continued for 30 minutes, and it became a masterclass in humiliation. Every tactic the German pilots tried, and these were experienced men who had survived years of combat, failed. The Mustang was faster in level flight, faster in a dive, could outclimb them, and despite being larger, could turn tighter at high speeds. When the Focke-Wulfs landed, their pilots climbed out, looking shaken. Werner had seen that expression before on the faces of men who had just survived combat against overwhelming odds. "It's not just fast," one pilot said, pulling off his leather helmet with trembling hands. "It's everywhere. You think you have position, you think you're setting up a shot, and suddenly it's behind you. And the acceleration. Gott I am Himmel. The acceleration. When he opens that throttle, It's like we're flying in reverse. But the tests weren't over. Next came the Bf-109, Germany's iconic fighter. Flown by an ace with over 100 kills. Surely the lighter, more maneuverable Messerschmitt would fare better? It didn't. The 109 pilot lasted 18 minutes before radioing, "I cannot engage. Repeat, I cannot maintain engagement." He controls the battle completely. Then came the moment that would haunt Werner for the rest of his life. They brought out a special aircraft, one of only 3 in existence. The Fo-190D-9, the Dora, Germany's newest fighter. It had a more powerful engine, improved aerodynamics, and was supposed to be the answer to the American threat. The Dora's pilot was confident. Werner could see it in his stride as he walked to his aircraft. This man believed in his machine. 22 minutes later, he landed, with that belief shattered. "It's faster than our operational fighters," the pilot reported, his voice hollow. "But against the Mustang, maybe I gain 50-60 kilometers per hour in top speed. It's not enough, not nearly enough. And the Mustang still outclimbs me, still outturns me at high speed. And," he paused, struggling with the words, "and it can do all of this for hours. I was at maximum power for 20 minutes, and my fuel gauge was screaming."
Muller says he still has fuel for another 2 hours of combat.
Galland had been silent throughout the trials, his face growing darker with each passing test. Now he turned to Werner, and there were tears in the general's eyes. "Do you understand what this means?" Galland asked quietly. "Every report, every combat loss, every pilot who told us about these silver demons, they were all telling the truth. We thought they were making excuses. We thought they were exaggerating." Werner nodded slowly. "They were understating it. Our fighters can't compete." Galland continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the 190, not the 109, not even the Dora. And the Americans have hundreds of these Mustangs, maybe thousands by now." From above, they heard the Mustang's engine, that smooth, powerful roar that was becoming a sound of nightmares. Muller brought the fighter in for a perfect landing, touching down with barely a bump. As the engine wound down, Werner checked his watch. Mueller had been in the air for 2 hours and 45 minutes of hard combat flying. The Mustang's fuel gauge, they would discover, still showed enough fuel for another hour. Werner looked at the assembled officers, engineers, and pilots. Every face showed the same expression, the look of men who had just realized they were already defeated. They just hadn't admitted it yet. "Gentlemen," Werner said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest, "we need to see the numbers. All of them. Now." The briefing room at Reckland felt like a tomb. Werner stood at the front, a chalkboard behind him covered in numbers, cold, merciless mathematics that spelled out the death of the Luftwaffe. Every officer in the room stared at those figures with the stunned silence of men watching their world collapse. "Let me be absolutely clear," Werner began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What I'm about to tell you is not speculation. These are measured facts from today's trials, confirmed by our instruments and by Hauptmann Muller's flight data." He turned to the board and pointed to the first column. Range. The P-51 Mustang, with drop tanks, has an operational combat radius of 1,300 kilometers. 1,300. He let that sink in. Our Bf-109 has a combat radius of 660 kilometers. The Fov-190, slightly better, at 800 kilometers. An engineering officer raised his hand, his face pale. "Herr Oberst, that means—" "Yes," Werner interrupted. "It means a Mustang taking off from England can escort American bombers to any target in Germany, engage in combat, and still return home. Our fighters must land to refuel, while the Mustangs keep fighting. We defend our cities in shifts. They attack in continuous waves." Galland stood up abruptly, walking to the window. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost. Werner continued. "Speed. Maximum speed at optimal altitude, 710 kilometers per hour. That's 60 to 90 kilometers per hour faster than anything we have in operational service. Gentlemen, let me translate that into combat terms. He paused, making sure every eye was on him. If a Mustang pilot decides to disengage from combat, there is nothing we can do to stop him. He simply flies away. We cannot catch him. What about diving? Asked Rawl. The FUF-190 is faster in a dive. Not anymore, Werner cut him off. We tested that. The Mustang has a critical Mach number higher than our fighters. It remains controllable at speeds that would tear our aircraft apart. In a dive, it matches or exceeds our best. He pointed to another set of numbers. Climb rate to 6,000 meters, 6 minutes. The FUF-190 takes 7.2 minutes. The BF-109 takes 7.5 minutes. In a combat scenario, that means Mustang formations can always hold the altitude advantage. They dictate the terms of every engagement. A Messerschmitt engineer stood up, his face red. This is impossible. The power-to-weight ratio, the wing loading our calculations, show the FUF-190 should be superior in— Your calculations are wrong, Muller interrupted, standing from his seat in the back. Every head turned. The test pilot's face was haggard, aged by what he had experienced. I've flown everything we have. I've flown captured Spitfires, Hurricanes, even a Soviet Yak. Nothing compares to what I flew today. He walked forward slowly, like a man in a trance. The engineering it's genius. Everything works together. The laminar flow wing gives it less drag than anything we've built. The radiator isn't just a radiator, it's designed to produce thrust from the cooling air. Even the weight distribution is perfect. It doesn't have any bad habits, no vices. It just flies. End quote. Werner nodded grimly, which brings us to the most damning number of all. He wrote a figure on the board in large numbers, 7, 5. That is the kill ratio we've calculated based on today's performance data and recent combat reports. For every Mustang we shoot down, we lose 7.5 aircraft, 7.5 German fighters, 7.5 trained pilots for every single one of theirs. The room erupted in protests, but Werner slammed his hand on the table. Silence. The numbers don't lie. In the last 3 months, we've lost over 800 aircraft defending the Reich. Intelligence reports the Americans now have over 1,500 Mustangs operational in Europe, with more arriving every week. Do the mathematics, gentlemen. Galland turned from the window, his voice bitter. We're training boys to fly. 16, 17 years old. 100 hours of flight time if they're lucky. We send them up against formations of Mustangs flown by Americans with 300, 400 hours of experience. And even when we send up our aces, men like Rawl, men with hundreds of kills, the best they can hope for is to survive. There's more, Werner said quietly. The Americans are using the Mustang's range for something new. They're not just escorting bombers anymore. They're hunting us. Free-range fighter sweeps over Germany, looking for our aircraft on the ground, on takeoff, on landing. They're destroying our fighters before they can even reach altitude. He pointed to a map of Germany on the wall, marked with red circles. In the past week alone, Mustangs have strafed and destroyed aircraft at 17 different airfields, not during combat. Just hunting. Like we're prey. An intelligence officer spoke up, his voice shaking. Herr Oberst, we've received reports that the Americans are developing an even better version, the P-51D. It has a bubble canopy for even better visibility, more ammunition, and— Enough, Galland said, his voice dead. We've heard enough, but Werner wasn't finished. There's one more thing you need to understand. I had our engineers examine the Mustang's construction in detail. The manufacturing quality is extraordinary. Perfect riveting, precise tolerances, advanced materials. This isn't a prototype. This isn't a special aircraft. This is their standard production model. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. Gentlemen, the Americans are building these aircraft at a rate of over 500 per month. 500. Our entire production of all fighter types combined is barely 1,000 per month, and that's if the Allied bombing doesn't disrupt our factories. The room fell silent again. In that silence, they could hear the truth screaming at them from every direction. One young officer, barely out of training himself, raised his hand hesitantly.
Herr Oberst, can we win?
Werner looked at him for a long moment. The boy couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He would probably be dead within a month. Win? No, Werner said quietly. Not anymore. Not against this. The only question now is how many more of our pilots have to die before the people in Berlin accept what we've learned here today. Galland walked back to the table and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his years. When the Mustangs first appeared over Germany, he said softly, I thought they were just another fighter. Better than what came before, yes, but still, just a fighter. We could adapt. We could overcome. He looked up at the men gathered in the room. I was wrong. This isn't just a better fighter. This is a revolution in aviation. Everything we thought we knew about air combat, about fighter design, about tactics, all of it is obsolete. And we're flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that has already entered the future. Outside, the captured Mustang sat gleaming in the evening light, beautiful and deadly. A prize that had become a prophecy. 3 weeks after the tests at Rechlin, Werner stood in a bunker beneath Berlin as American bombers pounded the city above. The walls shook with each impact, and dust rained from the ceiling like snow. Across the table sat Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, his face red with fury as he read Werner's report. Defeatist nonsense, Göring roared, slamming the papers down. You're telling me that one American fighter has made our entire Air Force obsolete? That's impossible. Our pilots are the best in the world. Our aircraft are superior German engineering. Werner remained calm, though his hands clenched beneath the table. Herr Reichsmarschall, the numbers don't lie. Neither do the bodies of our pilots. In the 3 weeks since our test, we've lost another 312 aircraft, the majority to Mustangs. Then our pilots are cowards. They lack fighting spirit. They lack fuel. Werner shot back, his patience finally breaking. They lack time to train. They lack aircraft that can compete. And most of all, they lack the truth. Because men like you refuse to accept it. The room went deathly silent. No one spoke to Göring that way, and lived. But Galland, who had accompanied Werner, stood up slowly. He's right. I've been in the air with them. I've seen what the Mustang can do. Our pilots aren't dying because they're cowards. They're dying because we're sending them to fight with swords against machine guns. Göring's face turned purple. But before he could respond, another explosion rocked the bunker. When the shaking stopped, Galland continued, his voice cold as ice. Do you want to know what the Mustang really represents? It's not just a fighter. It's proof that the Americans have already won the war. They have the resources to build thousands of these aircraft. They have the fuel to fly them continuously. They have the trained pilots to fly them effectively. And most importantly, they have the industrial capacity to innovate, to improve, to keep building better and better machines while we struggle to maintain what we have. Werner pulled out a photograph from his briefcase and placed it on the table. It showed the captured Mustang surrounded by German officers, all staring at it with expressions of shock and awe. This photograph was taken the day of our test, Werner said quietly. Every man in this picture is a fighter pilot or engineer. Men who have dedicated their lives to aviation. And every single one of them came to the same conclusion. We cannot win a war in the air against the P-51 Mustang. Not with what we have. Not with what we're building. Not with anything on our drawing boards. He leaned forward, his voice intense. The Mustang isn't just faster or longer ranged. It represents a completely different philosophy of warfare. The Americans built it to do one thing: dominate the skies over Europe completely and absolutely. And they succeeded. Goering was silent now, deflated like a balloon. The truth was crushing even his considerable ego. But perhaps the worst part, Werner continued, is what we learned from the pilot who flew it, the American we captured. Do you know what he told us during interrogation? He said the P-51 wasn't even America's best fighter. He said it was just their long-range escort fighter. They have others, the P-47, Thunderbolt, even more powerful. The P-38 Lightning, twin-engined and deadly. And they're building all of them by the thousands. He paused, letting that sink in. He also told us something else. He said that back in America, they're already designing the next generation. Jets, rocket planes, things we can't even imagine. While we're trying desperately to match the Mustang, they're already 3 steps ahead. 1. Galland walked to a map on the wall, showing Germany surrounded by red markers, Allied air bases, each one housing squadrons of Mustangs. Every day, the ring tightens, he said softly. Every day, more Mustangs arrive. Every day, we lose more pilots. Not just any pilots, but our best, our aces, the men we cannot replace. Yesterday, we lost Feldwebel Heinrich Bartels, 400 kills, shot down by a Mustang. The day before, Hauptmann Emil Lang, 173 kills, also a Mustang. He turned back to face Goering. These weren't novices. These weren't boys fresh from training. These were the best fighter pilots Germany has ever produced, and the Mustang killed them as easily as swatting flies. Werner stood up, gathering his papers. I've done what I came to do. I've given you the truth. What you do with it is your decision. But understand this. Every day we continue to send pilots up against Mustangs in aircraft that cannot compete is not bravery, it's murder. As Werner and Galland left the bunker, climbing the stairs toward the surface, they could hear the drone of American bomber engines overhead and the distinctive sound they had both learned to fear, the smooth, powerful roar of Merlin engines, Mustangs circling like sharks, waiting for any German fighter brave enough or foolish enough to challenge them. Do you think he'll listen? Galland asked. Werner looked up at the smoke-filled sky, where silver fighters glinted in the sunlight like angels of death. No, men like Goering never listen until it's too late. But at least we told the truth. At least history will know we tried. They walked out into the ruined streets of Berlin, past burned-out buildings and frightened civilians. Overhead, a formation of B-17 bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, and around them, like a swarm of silver wasps, dozens of Mustangs flew escort. Werner thought back to that morning at Rechlin, when he had first touched the captured fighter. He had been afraid of what they might learn. Now he knew his fear had been justified. The P-51 Mustang hadn't just revealed why the Luftwaffe was dying. It had revealed that the Luftwaffe was already dead. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. In the months that followed, everything Werner and Galland had predicted came true. The Mustangs came in ever greater numbers. German fighter losses mounted into the thousands. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost control of German airspace. Young pilots with barely any training were being shot down on their first missions. Aces with hundreds of kills were falling from the sky. And through it all, the Silver Mustangs ruled the skies, untouchable and unstoppable. The captured P-51B that revealed these terrible truths was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in July 1944, just 4 months after its test flight, but by then it had already served its purpose. It had shown the German high command exactly what they were facing, and exactly why they could not win. The test flight at Rechlin had lasted less than 3 hours. But in that brief time, a handful of German officers had witnessed the future of air warfare and understood that Germany had no place in it. The Mustang had been more than just a fighter. It had been a messenger, delivering a simple, terrible truth. The war in the air was over. America had won. Everything that came after was just counting the bodies.